Silently, the four off-worlders all observed the scene playing out in front of them, without either of them really knowing what to say about it. The two men were quietly talking under their breath, in a language Sheeta didn't understand, but it seemed like they had a lot of catching up to do. Or at least James did, as words continuously escaped him, seemingly without much time for a breath in between, while the older man only rarely opened his mouth to briefly interrupt him. His expression was soft and gentle, but otherwise quite unreadable, not really conveying any specific emotion. However, it seemed that at least James began to somewhat relax the longer the conversation went on between the two. The muscles of his face relaxed, his eyes and mouth specifically, and he looked less and less like he had just seen someone die by the moment. While those two were still going on, there was movement to her side, and Sheeta turned her head to see the main bulk of the human group approaching her, with Nia at the lead. She didn't quite ram into her like she had done with James. However, her excitedly unfurled arms almost seemed like a brief guarantee that she had not forgotten about Sheeta during her greetings of all her old family, friends and acquaintances. Sheeta reciprocated the gesture, and was now briefly squeezed by the taller woman, feeling the human's warm body press up against her for a comforting second, before they already separated again, and her gaze inadvertently wandered back over to James. Nia followed her eyes towards the unfurling scene, and a mild, slightly derisive smile crept across her face. "Give him a minute," she said, with a look up and down the two men. Sheeta flicked her ears for a second. "That's probably Flynn, right?" she asked, without a tone in her voice to indicate her space of mind. Nia just nodded and said, "In the flesh." Sheeta curled her lips. The Admiral's brother didn't quite look like she had imagined him. Like his sister, the man was a good bit shorter than James and had to look up to his nephew whenever James wasn't specifically leaning down to him. However, quite different from his sister, who had been barely touched by her age and could still easily be mistaken for a young woman if only briefly interacted with, this man clearly wore his every year on his weathered face, making the difference in age between the siblings seem to be astronomical. His salt and pepper hair and beard framed his slightly wrinkled face, in the picture of someone who had lived a lot and seen a lot more. There was also a sense that the man, despite clearly still being muscular and quite fit, and not just for his age, was past his prime, and had been in some form of decline for some years, since vague hints of a much prouder, powerful man remained in his demeanour for all to notice if they were willing to look. Meanwhile, as Sheeta made her assessments of James's father figure, of whom she had so far only heard the briefest of stories about, Andrej, Admir and Sam all came up to her from her side. Repeating Nia's earlier gesture, Admir pulled the feline into a hug, while Andrej and Sam stood by for a second and waved encouragingly. "Well, we're off," Admir informed her into her ear, his voice straining from the strength he used to really give the feline a good squeeze. "I hope you have a first-grade stay on Earth. Don't let James ruin it for you, alright?" Sheeta looked at him with slight confusion as she pulled away from him, her gaze also wandering over to the other humans. "You're leaving?" she asked, with a slight tilt of her head. Andrej and Sam nodded gently. "Been a while since we last went home," Andrej informed her leisurely, his hand resting on the large bag he wore on the sling around his body. "We're going to check in with our families for a bit." Sam sniggered next to him. "We might swing by after a bit when everyone's sick of us again," she informed, and lifted one hand into a half-hearted shrug, while the other held onto her suitcase. "But don't expect us too soon. I'm sure everyone's going to have a lot to say after this last mission." Sheeta blinked for a few seconds, processing that. Right. Going home to your family was probably a pretty normal thing to do among humans, after an extensive stay in outer space. "Right, I hope you all have fun," she replied after a moment of acclamation, and nodded back at each of them for a second. "And I wish you a safe trip." All of them chuckled and thanked her for a moment, briefly turning the courtesy of a quick goodbye around them towards the other off-worlders as well, who they were, however, still far less familiar with. And then they looked over at James. "Can we interrupt him yet?" Andrej asked for the opinions of the two others, with a quick sideways glance. "Course we can," Admir chuckled, and didn't skip a beat before starting to march over to the still ongoing reunion. "Now take all day if we don't," Sam concurred with him, and also sauntered over, swinging her hand holding her suitcase over her shoulder as she did so. Without saying anything on the matter, Andrzej followed them after a second, scoffing and shaking his head on the way. Sheila paused briefly and looked after them, before a movement in their periphery caught her eye. Encouragingly, Nia nodded in the direction of her brother and gave Sheila a knowing look that said as much as, "Go already." Without thinking much about it, she obliged. When she reached the newly formed group, James and his uncle had separated, and it seemed like everyone was in full swings of their goodbyes. "And give everyone my best wishes," James said, as he was just letting go of Admir after a seemingly extensive hug. "They'd have my head if I didn't," Admir laughed in return, and scratched the side of his head. "It's going to be hard enough to not have them all fly over to personally give you theirs." James chuckled in response. "Let them. It's been ages since I've seen your family," he replied with a bit of laughter, to which Admir rolled his eyes. "And whose fault is that?" he asked facetiously, while slightly stepping back so the humans would be evenly spaced out in front of James. James, seemingly not quite able to counter that probably very true accusation, could do little more than awkwardly laugh it off while his old team gradually turned to leave. "See you around, kid," Andres said with a long wave. "Don't miss us too much," Admir added while following the Major. Sam held eye contact with James for a moment longer, before giving him a nod that was so deep that it almost turned into a bow. With a smile creeping across his face, James returned the gesture. Then the three, one after another, gave Flynn much-saying looks before they completely turned to leave, waving with the backs of their hands all the way until they reached the other side of the busy road, with everyone else waving after them as well. Without needing any further prompting, James then turned around and gently put an arm around Sheida, while pulling her in closer to him and his uncle. "And this is Sheida," he introduced her, with brief words while nodding at his uncle, who now inspected her for a moment. It seemed like his eyes themselves were tired, but there was still an attentive spark to them as he studied the feline. "Yeah, I know. I saw the news," the old man finally commented with a very hoarse laugh. His voice lacked the usual wholeness that human vocalizations had, and it sounded like it had probably been abused quite badly over the years, leaving it as a raspy husk of its former self. "Very glad to finally make your acquaintance, Sheida. The name's Flynn Krieger. You probably heard about me at some point, but never got any details past that." He chuckled again while reaching a hand out to Sheida, which he quickly shook. His grip was strong. "That's, surprisingly accurate," she admitted while she shook his hand, and Flynn tilted his head in slight mockery. "Well, I raised this guy here," he commented, and jabbed against James's chest with the back of his hand. "I've seen it all before. Never really got his teeth unstuck from each other, that boy." Against Sheida's expectations, James didn't react to the jab with a retort of his own. Instead, he simply took the criticism with a mild smile and continued the conversation as if it hadn't happened. "I can't wait to show you our place down on Earth," he said, with an excited anticipation in his voice. Sheida nodded in nervous excitement. However, she couldn't help but notice that there seemed to be a brief flash of worry across Flynn's face. Why that was, however, she couldn't quite tell. "All for a bitching welcome party," the old man instead mused, with a strangely mocking tone, to which James reacted by giving him a harsh yet humorous look. "Don't you dare," he warned his uncle with a mechanical finger raised. "I've had enough fuss made around me for a lifetime already." Flynn scoffed. "Not like I'd have time for that anyway," he said in a clearly dismissive tone, although his gaze noticeably lingered on the mechanical appendage for a good long while, despite him never acknowledging as much. "Some of us still have to work." James sniggered before beginning to slightly turn. "Well, you have plenty of time to get to know each other, I'm sure, so how about I introduce you to everyone else?" he asked, without waiting for much input from his uncle's side, instead immediately beginning to guide Sheida along back to the rest of the Offworlders. To Sheida, it seemed like Flynn was used to this kind of behaviour and just rolled with it out of habit as he slowly skulked along, following after his nephew with his hands in the pockets of his grey jacket. Although the moment James had turned his back on him, his expression seemed to deflate somewhat, turning into a resting face of exhaustion. Although he didn't seem to be intent on hiding it, since Sheida was quite obviously looking at him as it happened. "You remember me telling you about my uncle?" James excitedly asked the other Offworlders, and gestured behind his back to indicate towards the man. Curious eyes turned onto the man as he approached. "Indeed," Moore announced, after a moment of her dark eyes inspecting him, and she leaned down her massive head as she addressed Flynn directly.
"It is a pleasure to finally meet the man that raised our James so selflessly. It can't have been easy to take care of your nephew like that, but I greatly respect and appreciate your decision. You've raised a fine young man."
Flynn kept his hands in his pockets as he looked up at the giant.
"Well, I already raised his mother," he then replied with a brief shrug. "Figured I might as well complete the set."
Moore seemed to be slightly put off by the man's aloof demeanour. However, James just laughed. "This is Moore Bistry," he informed his uncle, with a gesture at the old Raphaelite. "She was the first friend I made after leaving Earth." Flynn hummed in acknowledgement.
"I appreciate you taking care of the kid while he was roughing it on his own,"
he then said, with an appreciative nod towards the fuzzy titan, which now got a more genuine reaction out of her.
"Oh, I never needed to take much care of him,"
Moore admitted, running her claws through a patch of long fur on her arm.
"James is quite independent as a person."
Flynn shifted his lips slightly, while his eyes darted to his nephew for a second.
"Yeah,"
he mumbled, almost more to himself than his surroundings. "And this is Curie," James then piped up again, pulling Sheeta along as he made a step over towards the cyborg, lowering his mechanical hand onto one of their large legs. "I pulled them out of a fire once." Flynn nodded towards the cyborg. Curie inspected him attentively with their glowing red eyes. "It is a pleasure to meet you," they then earnestly stated, and briefly lowered the front pair of their body in an imitation of a bow. It was simultaneously unusually courteous and brief for the cyborg, making Sheeta wonder if it was something about the man, or if the cyborg had simply changed a lot during their stay with the humans. Lastly, attention turned towards Conglorge. Meanwhile, as James introduced the giant lizard and explained the particular circumstances their friendship had formed under, with the Tenastrocyte himself giving a boisterous account of his own about the glorious terror the two had brought to the GCS, which seemed to be an assessment that James didn't quite agree with. The rest of their little travel group began to slowly reconvene with them, apparently figuring they had given everybody enough time to themselves now.
"Admiral, Commander."
Moore greeted Krieger and Keown with a nod of her large head, although she seemed to be taken aback slightly by the close manner in which the two human officers walked together. "Miss Bistry," the Admiral returned with a courteous nod, while Keown unfurled his free arm widely, loudly greeting her with,
"Moore, good to see you again."
They then also briefly greeted the others with similar levels of enthusiasm, while Coco stood a bit aside and watched as everything unfurled. Seeing her, James opened his mouth. However, she quickly stopped him with a hand. "I've heard the introduction so far," she informed him quickly, and turned towards the group with a friendly smile and wave. "Hey everyone, I'm Coco. Nice to meet you." The sentiment was echoed back at her for a moment, while she quickly came over to where James and Sheeta were standing. "You still need winter clothes, right?" she asked, without a moment of hesitation, pointing right at Sheeta's chest. Sheeta blinked slightly while processing the question. "Seems like it," she replied, after briefly thinking about what James had told her earlier. Apparently Earth was cold, or at least the area they were going was. Coco nodded, and then pointed her thumb over her shoulder behind her. "Want to go with us?" she asked, indicating towards Nia and, to Sheeta's surprise, Tuya, who stood a bit off to the side and were quietly talking to each other while keeping their faces close together. "Seems like Tuya also needs some." Sheeta tilted her head. "Tuya's not gone yet?" she asked, to which Coco chuckled. "No, she's coming down with us," she informed, to which Sheeta looked up at James to see if he knew. While it seemed that he hadn't known for sure, a sort of knowing smile on his face indicated that he had at least figured as much, and therefore wasn't entirely surprised by it. Coco didn't linger on the topic, though. "Anyway, Nia's probably way better at picking out winter clothes for someone who really gets cold than James is, since I doubt he'll be even really wearing any, and I'm coming along to catch up. If you're coming as well, we can make this an entire girl thing." There was a brief yet suspicious glint in James's eyes as Coco elaborated her plan. However, he refrained from making any statement on the issue, indicating that it was entirely Sheeta's choice. For a moment, she wondered why he didn't offer to come along, before realizing that Coco's phrasing had made it quite obvious that he seemingly wouldn't be welcome to do so for the moment. She looked at everyone for a second. There still was a lot she needed to talk about. However, the same was probably true for everyone. And she would still have some time for it, perhaps after everyone else had already gotten their sentiments out, and it would be less cluttered and crowded together. And seeing how he had reacted to first seeing his uncle earlier, maybe it was good to give James some room for a moment. "I promise I won't be a stranger," she said, as she let go of James and briefly bowed to everyone else. Hopefully they would believe her, and not think she was just trying to get out of things. She then briefly cuddled up to James, rubbing her face against his for a second, before allowing Coco to lead her away from the scene of the reunion, and joining up with the rest of the women about to go on a shopping trip. As they made their way through the streets of this Martian colony, Sheeta quickly learned the hard way that humans really seem to live on top of each other most of the time. No matter where they went, the streets were seemingly always filled with people, and there was never any sign that any of the humans thought this to be either weird or uncomfortable in any way, meaning that this cramped way of living apparently was the status quo for at the very least a huge number of humans. The buildings also kept adding on to that image, as they just kept stacking higher and higher with their levels, meaning that more and more people would be living and or working in there. As the streets turned from their previously beige colour to a greyer tone, she was informed that they were now entering the more modern area of this particular dome, and the architecture reflected as much, as the streets got much wider and many of the buildings, especially the public ones, got a lot bigger, likely so they could accommodate for off-worlders, as well as for humans. However, the specific locations they seemed to be aiming for were generally still built at human sizes, which likely has something to do with them being boutiques or other clothing stores, meaning that very few off-worlders would ever have to set foot in there for their own purposes, and even those who did would generally be of a size that could work with this sort of space, like Sheeta. Still, even though they never entered any, Sheeta did make note of many other establishments they passed, either due to her own interest or because they were pointed out to her by one of her accompanying humans. Apparently, humans ate a lot. That much wasn't technically news to Sheeta, however, she had never quite realised just how much that statement was true. Around every corner, and wherever you looked, it seemed that some form of restaurant or takeaway or even small stand at the road was never far out of reach, and a lot of them seemed to sell entirely different things that different kinds of humans seemed to swoon over. Granted, to her, most of it was pretty unappealing, as big parts of almost any meal seemed to consist of some form of vegetation, and even those which would have usually been to her carnivorous tastes had been entirely tainted by some form or another of condiments that were slathered all over them, and which usually consisted of some form of botanical deterrent, which did its job quite well on Sheeta, but apparently had no success whatsoever in deterring any of the humans from consuming it. She knew that it was likely slightly exaggerated in her mind, but to Sheeta, it quickly seemed like there were few things that humans would not put into their mouths. It seemed like an omnivorous diet that allowed you to enjoy all kinds of foods yourself, led to the strangely paradoxical side effect of having almost no one else being able to enjoy the foods you made yourself, since they all contained wild mixes of ingredients, at least one of which would probably deter most other species from trying it out. Other notable stores were tons and tons of peddlers of electronic goods, often seemingly connected to one specific brand, but just as often also selling all of the brands at the same time. These stores ranged from very specialised and selling only one kind of thing, for example the human phones or exclusively vacuums, to having no specification whatsoever, and just trying to get people to buy everything in one place. Sheeta wasn't sure if that meant that the human market was more or less competitive than the one she knew from Dunaba, since it seemed that there was no clear dominating winner between the two forms of commerce she observed. Maybe there were just so many of the humans that those preferring the one kind and those preferring the other kind were both numerous enough that both branches managed to keep themselves alive with their clientele alone. The primates did outnumber the Miat by at least a 4-to-1 ratio after all. Maybe that gave the market more leeway. That's how it usually worked in communal spaces at least, so maybe the same principle applied here. Clothing stores appeared to be the third most numerous thing you would run into, and they showed much of the same concepts. Hyper-specialised stores, to stores carrying only one brand, to general stores seemingly selling everything. Seeing as the woman she was accompanying here had so far entirely ignored most of them, Sheeta wondered if they were aiming to lead her towards a specific store carrying a specific brand, or if they maybe had a favourite among the general stores, where they would always go to get almost all their clothing needs. Her question was somewhat answered when they arrived at the largest structure Sheeta had seen around here so far, apart from the domes themselves. It was way too big to just be one store, and the outside also didn't give much indication about what exactly was inside. The only thing Sheeda could see were large, bold letters that were attached above the entrance that spelled out Huamani Gallery, which Sheeda had at first misread as Human Gallery, and wondered what would have led to such an odd name before realizing her mistake. "What's a gallery?" she asked quietly, leaning over to Coco, who was standing closest to her, as she was unfamiliar with that term in what she had learned of the English language so far. If that even was English. "In this context, another word for mall, basically," the human commander quickly elaborated, before gently putting a hand against Sheeda's back to hurry her along and inside, seemingly rather excited about all of this. Then again, Sheeda had so far not seen the commander not be excited about anything she did, so maybe that was just the woman's style. Despite being technically part of the same group, Tuyu and Nia seemed to stick a bit closer to each other, and only every now and then fully brought their attention to either Sheeda or the commander when they really had something to say. Now that they all stepped inside through the large entrance, Sheeda looked around impressed. Continuing the human's trend of stacking things on top of each other in boxy forms, this appeared to be the culmination of that. The inside of the massive structure was nothing but rows and rows of stores, all right next to each other and stacked high on multiple levels. Everywhere there were signs, advertisements, and glowing letters trying to get your attention towards their own establishment. And if you didn't like one of them, you only needed to walk a few measures at most and you would already reach the next. Competition in this place must have been crazy. To Sheeda's great relief, the place also wasn't all that cramped, even if it was still a bit fuller than she would have liked in such a tightly packed space. At least people weren't walking shoulder on shoulder anymore. "So," Nia suddenly spoke up, and took a few steps forward so she could look back at the group while clapping her hands a single time. "What did you have in mind?" Her eyes wandered back and forth between Sheeda and Tuyu expectantly, while the two addressed parties briefly exchanged a glance. Sheeda had no idea. She knew neither leather nor metal to be exceptionally good at keeping you warm, and those were the things she'd usually go for. In this case, something like a fur would probably be her choice, but looking around, she saw very few furs being worn by the general human population. She felt like she had seen a few, but it didn't seem to be the main choice around here, which also didn't bother her so much, since she wasn't a huge fan of furs in the first place. "It gets colder back home, so I'll probably be fine with just a thicker jacket," Tuyu mused after a moment and shrugged, before looking over at Sheeda again. "But thinking back to Dunama, she's probably going to need the whole package." Nia nodded and looked at Sheeda. "You get cold easily?" she asked with a candid look. Sheeda awkwardly shrugged. "No idea. I don't usually go to cold places," she informed honestly, seeing as apparently even the fridge itself didn't really recognize as cold to humans. "But I like to stay as warm as possible." Nia nodded understandingly. "Me too," she said, and as even the thought of the cold got shivers running through her, she briefly rubbed her arms with her hands, before determinedly shaking her head. "Don't worry, I'll get you packed up good. I'll show you where I get my stuff and see if you like any of it." With that, she led the group past rows and rows of the tightly clustered shops in this gallery, single-mindedly trudging towards the location of the shop she had in mind for them. Going in, it immediately became clear that this place wasn't exactly specializing in clothing. Instead, it seemed to be some kind of gear shop for sports and activities that probably weren't practiced on Dunama, at least not to Sheeda's knowledge. Most of the stuff they sold consisted of some sort of boards, some wide, some thick, apparently intended to be strapped onto human feet to traverse what looked like unbelievably thick layers of snow, which was a concept Sheeda mostly knew from stories and pictures herself, since it generally only existed in inhospitable climates. The humans using these boards on the depictions around the displays of the wares all seemed to have quite a bit of fun doing whatever it was you would do with these things. However, given the anatomy of Sheeda's own feet, it looked like she wouldn't be trying it anytime soon. Some clothes snuck in here and there, but many of them also didn't appear intended for everyday use. Blue-shaded glasses that were strapped to your face like safety goggles, for example, or very thick, heavy-looking boots that were apparently specialized to be used in tandem with the strange footboards. Although, admittedly, Tuya didn't have to search long before she found a nice, fitting jacket that she could use to ward off the seemingly little part of the cold that would ultimately bother her. It was very thick and red in most places, with some grey accents scattered around along the arms and around the zipper, keeping it closed. It was also loud. The material rustled a lot whenever its filling was compressed, and the surface was rough enough that it made loud hiss-like sounds whenever it ground against itself. Ideally, Sheeda would find a quieter material for herself, since the constant noise already started to get on her nerves even during the brief fitting. "Looks good," Nia commented excitedly, as Tuya presented her choice with a brief twirl, while Nia was coming back from fetching an item from further back in the shop, now presenting it to Sheeda. It was some sort of black fabric in a protective plastic package. After taking it out, Sheeda inspected it between her fingers. It was heavier than it looked, and seemed to be some very dense and flexible material. While Sheeda inspected the item, Nia in turn inspected Sheeda's noticeably inhuman legs. "I hope these work for you," she mumbled contemplatively, while her eyes glided along the, to her, likely strange curving of Sheeda's legs. "These should be your size, but you'll probably have to try them on. There are some changing rooms over there, so I hope you don't mind." She pointed to a few small, sectioned-off cabins lining one wall of the store that could be closed up from view with curtains that formed a sort of pseudo-door. Sheeda unquestioningly stepped inside one of them, now seeing a large mirror lining one of the walls, and closed the curtain behind her. She didn't quite know how much she trusted the flimsy fabric to protect her privacy, but with 3 women waiting for her outside, 2 of which were military, she had little doubt that she would likely be safe from anyone trying anything. Not that she needed protection in the first place. Following the hint that Nia's looks had given her earlier, she figured these were probably for her legs, so she quickly changed out of her pants and into the elastic yet very tight-fitting things that Nia had picked out for her there. She could somewhat tell that these weren't made for her former legs. However, it wasn't really restrictive enough to hinder her. It would probably become a better fit after wearing it for a while, and allowing the material to adapt to her form. The biggest problem was, of course, her tail, which these tires had absolutely no room for. However, since this was only a fitting, and the problem could likely be tackled by a tailor at some point in the near future, she just slung her tail around her body for the time being, with only a little part of it being covered by the black pant item. She inspected herself in the mirror. It really was a tight fit. Tighter even than her own leather items, and much less concealing, ultimately, as the softer fabric was much more willing to press up to her form instead of wrapping around it. She wasn't entirely sure about this look. It also didn't look like most of the other pants that she had seen the Primus walk around in. Maybe she was missing something here. Deciding to ask the expert, she pulled the curtain open again, making the women waiting for her behind it to look up in slight surprise, before they began to quickly study her. There was a certain appreciation in all of their eyes for a moment, although in Nia and Tuya it quickly turned to a more rationally evaluating expression. Not in Coco, though. She took the sight in with seemingly unabated enjoyment. "Do they fit all right?" Nia asked, quickly getting closer to give her a closer but quite professional once-over. Sheeda nodded and briefly turned to show off the fit, while also twisting her head around to try and see if there was any odd place where it seemed like something was out of whack. "The fit is fine," she said contemplatively, while coming to a stop again and looking Nia in the eyes. "I'm just not sure about the look. I mean, I don't mind tight clothes usually, but these are a bit..." She left that statement there, feeling it would be more effective to let the women fill in the blanks themselves. Nia's face turned almost mortified, while Tuya's reaction went in the opposite direction as she snorted in amusement. "These aren't meant to be worn alone," the lieutenant quickly informed Sheeda, still sniggering while Nia was seemingly still trying to find her words. "I mean, you can if you want, and some do. Hell, I've done it before, but usually they're supposed to go under your actual pants." "I don't know, I mean," Coco said from her side, a hand shooting up as she framed Sheeda with her fingers for a moment, while taking in the sights once more. "I think you can pull it off." Nia shot her an almost venomous glare, before quickly shaking her head and walking over to Sheeda, as if she needed to get physically closer to truly apologize. No, sorry, Tuya's right. These are just meant to keep your legs warm. Of course, you wear a normal pair of pants above," she said. And it almost seemed like the dark-skinned human was trying to physically coax her back into the changing room to protect her from any further looks thrown her way. The reaction was a bit much, Sheeda found. It wasn't like she was actually embarrassed about wearing this. She just hadn't been sure about it all the time. "Ah, makes sense," she still informed Nia calmingly, and now willingly stepped back into the cabin. Yeah, these should be fine for that. Although, admittedly, there was a bit of dread creeping up on her, as she realised what this explanation meant. Just how cold was it where James and Nia lived, that it was necessary to have an entire extra article of clothing just to keep your legs warm underneath your pants? Bagging a good number of these thermo-leggings, as Sheeta was informed they were called, so she would have plenty of spares during her stay on Earth, the shoppers soon turned their attention towards more general clothing items. Luckily, the body plan of humans and Miat was similar enough that, apart from pants and shoes, most clothes could easily be shared between the two species, so there was a lot less to worry about from there on out. Gloves proved to be a small challenge given her longer fingers and shorter palms. However, just buying a size larger than Sheeta actually needed was a quick fix that she already knew from the UHSDF's uniforms. Although she still wasn't the biggest fan of wearing so much cloth and fabric, Sheeta had to admit that some of the stacks of pullovers and hoodies that they all picked out for her together actually did seem a bit nicer to her than the usual furs back on Dunama would have. Maybe there was an exception to be made for very warm clothing specifically, whenever leather or metal just really wasn't a viable option. And yes, in the end, they also found her a thick jacket made of nice, quiet material that didn't narrowly chafe whenever she moved. Though the form was a bit weird, since it had seemingly waves or hills or material running horizontally along it that were separated by seams in between. At least it felt nice and really kept her warm. All throughout the process of picking out the articles, the demeanour of her three accomplices remained rather constant. Nia, always helpful and professional, if a bit nervous, Tuya with amusement, quick comments, and, if necessary, scathing criticism, and Coco, who was mostly along for the ride but did keep Sheeta's confidence up with compliments and flirtatious comments. For a bit, Sheeta wondered if she should have been in any way worried about the commander's seemingly very open interest in her. However, on the other hand, she had also greeted James by grabbing his butt, so clearly he was aware of this sort of behaviour from her end, and it wasn't like she herself minded all that much. Seeing as she was surrounded exclusively by women for now, Sheeta also briefly lamented the after effects of her heat that she would soon be suffering through, now that the bane was starting to slowly fade from her awareness, meaning her body was already preparing to tear itself apart, now that it had become clear that there wouldn't be any fertilized eggs to nurse into full-on babies anytime soon. James had told her that this apparently happened to humans on a much more frequent, if slightly less severe scale. And indeed, the women seemed to have some well-meant input on the topic and some products they recommended to be tried out during that time of pain, although they did excuse themselves when it came to any pain relievers, seeing as her biology was a good bit different from theirs. Although, to Sheeta's surprise, despite being very helpful and talkative for the rest of their endeavours, Nia was noticeably quieter when the topic came up, leaving Tuya and Coco to do most of the talking. Maybe the topic was just awkward for her. She seemed to be a bit more physically reserved than the other two, or even her brother. After the shopping was done, Coco was quick to invite everyone to cold drinks, which, after a quick description of what that entailed, Sheeta enthusiastically declined, although she would gladly come along with everyone else while they got theirs. The stand they went to was open, mostly green, and behind the counter there was a variety of fruits and seemingly some sort of frozen something in large tubs, as well as a large machine that loudly worked away at crushing or grinding something inside as they came closer. The machine itself released a rather pungent odour that forced Sheeta to take a few steps back while she waited for everyone else to get their orders. She had smelled it before. They called it coffee, and apparently it consisted mostly of pesticides, so that explained why it smelled like bitter death to her, although it likely wasn't all that dangerous, just disgusting. Once they were done with their order, and now each held a colourful cup in their hands, Coco almost immediately held hers out towards Sheeta. It contained a pinkish, thick liquid that didn't exactly scream appealing in any way. Still, as the commander casually offered, "You want to try?" Sheeta's instincts took over and she accepted almost automatically, taking a quick sip through the offered straw before Tuya, who stood a bit further back, had the chance to stop her like James usually did. The stuff was cold and thick and tangy, almost sour. Definitely unappetizing. However, Sheeta still quickly swallowed it before giving the cup back to Coco, her face likely telling of her experience in the process. "That can't be good for your stomach," Tuya commented, after watching everything unfold. However, as there was nothing to be done about it now, She just began casually sipping her own drink. And like that, they got on their way to once again join back up with the others.